Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Hello and welcome to the Afternoon Light podcast. Today I'm speaking to Keith Mason QC, who is a former president of the Court of Appeal of New South Wales. He is also a former Solicitor General for New South Wales and has served as chairman of the New South Wales Electoral Commission, and he is currently a visiting professorial fellow at the University of New South Wales. So welcome to Afternoon Light, Keith.
Thank you for having me.
And Keith, we've got you on the Afternoon Light podcast today because we wanted to talk to you about something historical and something contemporary. The historical thing being the Egon Kisch case, which was a extremely high profile in its time in the 1930s immigration law case. But then, of course, the contemporary issue was the Novak Djokovic case that came before the federal court in January, just one short month ago. It seems so long ago now, but it was only it was less than a month ago. But Keith, you've written on the Egon Kisch case, and I'm sure you have your views on the Novak Djokovic case and decision. But tell me about the Egon Kisch case of 1934.
Well, actually, there were several cases. Kisch was a communist, a Jew. He suffered under Hitler. He was invited to come out and speak at the end of 1934 at a series of rallies by the peace movement. These were designed to be counter rallies to the celebration of the centenary of Melbourne, at which the Duke of Gloucester was coming out. At the start of the rallies, the Melbourne ones greatly outnumbered the Kisch rallies, but at the end of the time, thanks in part to the inability to get Kisch quickly and quietly out of the country, there were bigger crowds at Kisch's gigs than at the Conservative ones. Menzies was, of course, very involved on the Conservative side of things, and this all happened just about the time he moved from Attorney General for Victoria to get the seat of Kooyong, catapulted into federal parliament in the new Lyons Government, and was made Attorney General in that government. And Menzies, as Attorney General, took up the legal fight involving Kisch with spectacular series of failures, usually at the hand of Evatt, who in the 1930s outclassed him. Of course, we all know Menzies got his comeback
in the 50s.
in later times, yes. But in the 1930s, that set definitely went to Evatt. So there were a series of Kisch cases. He was invited out, and before he arrived, the Minister for the Interior, I think his name was Patterson, but on the direction of the Lyons Government, decided that he should be kept out of the country and barred from entry. And so there were a series of attempts to use powers under the Immigration Act to bar him from entry on the basis that he was an unsuitable person to be in Australia at the time. So the first case occurred just as he arrived in Perth by ship, intending to get a train across to Melbourne. But a notice was served on the ship's captain, a man named Carter, which he was obliged to respect if it was valid. And so Carter refused to let Kisch get off the ship. And the ship then sailed around to Melbourne, by which time legal proceedings started to get underway. The first Kisch case was before the Chief Justice of Victoria, an attempt to get habeas corpus, and that failed on the ground that Kisch was an alien, which is a clearly invalid reason to refuse habeas corpus, but there it was. The second case, which came in the High Court before Justice Evatt, who heard it as a single judge, sought to have declared invalid the notice from the minister reciting that he thought Kisch was an undesirable person to enter.
Right.
And it had to use, there was power to do this. It had to use a particular formula, which included, I've been informed by the British government that such and such and such and such, and I formed the view that he should not be allowed to enter. But when the case came before Justice Evatt, the government wasn't prepared, because it didn't really have proper evidence to show that it had received a notification from the British government that Kisch was persona non grata. So in a technical but very proper ruling, the notice barring him was declared invalid. In the meantime, just after he'd been refused habeas corpus in Victoria, Kisch literally jumped ship.
This is when it really descends into high farce, this saga, yes, doesn't it?
Yeah. And in doing so, he broke his leg.
Yeah.
He wrote a book about it later, which he called Australian Landfall. and it was full of sporting puns, which he said that Australia's a sporting nation, they will appreciate what I did. So he fell. The police picked him up. He said, look, I've arrived in Australia, you must take me before a court.
Yeah.
The police said no way, and they bundled him back on board the ship, which sailed around to Sydney.
With his broken leg.
with his broken leg. And the proceedings that I mentioned a little bit earlier on took place in Sydney. In the meantime, Evatt granted Kisch bail, and he started to, so unlike Mr. Djokovic, he was able to go at liberty, and he went to a huge anti-war rally in the Sydney Domain, and was able to carry on
with a broken leg.
With a broken leg, waving at his crutches, but doing it while the case was argued.
Right.
So having won his first case, the government, and by this stage Menzies was Attorney General, and he was in effect calling the shots. The government then decided to invoke the dictation test, which was part of the White Australian policy.
I think, though, it would be worth reflecting on why the Lyons government was so worried about Egon Kisch. I mean, you said that they weren't able to produce any evidence of advice from the British government about why he was considered undesirable, but he was a communist and a communist activist. He'd been jailed in Germany. There were concerns in Australia about communists and communist activities. But was it just because he was a communist activist, or was there... He had been banned from entering Britain, I understand. So it's
correct,
it's curious that the Australian government hadn't received anything that they could at least produce in the High Court in terms of advice from the British government about their concerns, and why the British government, for example, had banned Kisch from entering Britain.
Well, the British Secret Service wasn't prepared to share its intel with the Australian people. I think that's the factual reason. Why was it an issue? Look, like many of these things, we look back on them and say that it was a culture war, but things were in a huge transition. In the 1930s, the international workers of the world, communism, what people had genuine fears about the spread of communism. We all know that it had never really thrived in in Australia that its main job was to keep the Menzies government elected through the 1960s, but as a force, it did have some success in the unions, but there was genuine fear in the 1930s about it. There was also, I think, in the, shall I say, the Melbourne establishment, but certainly the establishment, there was only a very belated realisation of how terrible things were in Germany.
Yes.
And that part of Kisch's message was to say, look, this is happening already.
Yes.
I've been imprisoned. It will happen. But people, because they feared communism more than they feared rising fascism, there just wasn't a recognition. And so these were two worldviews, one on the rise and one perhaps on the decline, but both sides of Australian politics took polarised positions.
And it's also worth reflecting too that Kisch was not just a communist, he was a Jew, so he would have experienced in Germany pretty significant discrimination because of that identity and race as well. Yes. Keith, so the dictation test, this is this is where the Kisch case gets even. I mean, you think the broken leg's enough, but it even descends into more high farce with the dictation test put to very good use. Yeah. But tell me, before we unpack the details of that part of the story, which every time I hear it, I can't help but chuckle. How did the dictation test come to be in Australia? It's as you said, part of the White Australia policy. It was a tool used to preserve White Australia. But how did it come to be?
Yeah, well, if we think that 20th century and 21st century politics can be racist, it's nothing compared to the 19th century.
Yeah.
And the attempts that were made by Sir Henry Parkes to keep Chinese immigrants out. There were court cases then. It was nakedly racist. In 1897, the government of Natal in South Africa came up with this dictation test, and they did it under guidance of the British government. Many people said, look, let's just be honest. We don't want Chinese or Indians coming because we are racist, or, as Sir Alfred Deakin put it, it's not their bad qualities we fear, it's their good qualities. They work so hard, they are taking jobs.
They make us look bad.
Yeah, but everybody, including the debates, if you read the debates in 1901 in the Federal Parliament, they were nakedly racist. All of the people were just saying, we're got to keep these Chinese out. The question was how to do it. The British government had lent on the government in Natal and said, look, we have interests in Asia, like India, and we don't want to upset the Japanese people. Can't we do it with a bit of a fig leaf in an indirect way? So they came up with this dictation test, which was used in New South Wales before it was used federally, and it was a legal fiction, but you were to be administered a test of 50 words in any European language. So the European was the way they got the White Australia bit in, so it was any European language. It would be put to you, and you would write it down, and if you understood, you passed. If you failed, you were deemed to be a prohibited immigrant. An incredible parliamentary fiction, but that's how it worked.
So if you were Italian and you did the dictation test and they spoke to you, they said you need to take dictation in Greek and you didn't speak Greek, despite speaking Italian, a European language, you were stuffed, basically.
Yes, but Kisch in the 1930s was the first European to be given the test. It was always used on Asians.
Right.
And they would be taken off to the nearest Greek restaurant where the owner of the restaurant would dictate something in Greek, and the poor Chinese man who'd been found in the outback of Australia wandering around would fail. He would be arrested. He'd be arrested and would be thrown out unless he took the matter to court. And even if he did, he would fail. So the irony was that he was Kisch. He was European to the bootstraps.
Yeah.
He was fluent in about 8 languages. So they said, well, let's give him the dictation test. And so they chose Scottish Gaelic.
Yes, they thought he'd probably not quite have mastered that one, despite the 8 others he'd mastered.
So a young policeman was brought in. He wasn't very familiar with Scottish Gaelic either. I think he'd only heard his father speak it. So he said, I'm going to give you the test in Gaelic. Kisch just laughed and said, I'm not going to do it. And so he was rearrested and brought before the court. The magistrate ruled that he had he'd failed the test. Not before there was some high farce, because the Scottish policeman who'd given the test was cross-examined, and a passage from the Lord's Prayer in Scottish Gaelic was put to him. And he said, that's not a very nice expression, because he didn't know how to translate it either. Anyway, Kisch was found guilty and ordered to be jailed for 6 months, because this all was done with a sort of a criminal law context. You were jailed for being in the country, and what happened was you were jailed, but you were put on the next boat out of the country, but you were jailed. So Kisch was jailed for 6 months, and he appealed to the High Court again, this time coming before 4 judges or 4 or 6 judges, and the High Court by 5 judges, including Evatt, and the High Court by a majority of 4-1 ruled that Scottish Gaelic was not a European language.
Oh dear.
There were so few people in such obscure parts of Scotland that it didn't qualify as a national language. Or there was a lot of learning about what languages were. There was a dissenting judgment by Stark, but it was held not to be a European language.
I don't think that would have gone down well with the Scottish community.
Well, there were a series of letters to the Herald by a whole lot of the Reverend Mr. So-and-so, the Chancellor of Sydney University, Mungo McCallum. Yes, who's I think got daughter or granddaughter who's currently in Australia, but McCallum. And they all said, what a set of dimwits you are. Don't you know that this and that? Kisch then launched contempt of court proceedings against them, which came on for hearing before Evatt again. And the Herald produced an abject apology and said, we didn't mean to insult the High Court, and they were let off just being ordered to pay the costs. So that was 2 or 3 failures. So they had another go at Kisch. They applied another section of the Immigration Act. It came again before Evatt. Evatt tentatively ruled that the provision didn't apply to someone who had already arrived in the country. It was designed to deal with people before they got here. And the Commonwealth said, that's terrible, could you refer it to a full court? Evatt referred it to a full court and adjourned it for 6 or 8 weeks. And at that stage, Menzies, the Attorney General, sued for peace. He said, look, if we pay you your costs, if we give you some compensation, since you've been able to speak at every rally the the anti-war movement wants to speak out. Are you ready to go home? And Kisch said yes. Kisch said, yes, I'll take it. He wrote a book and he left the country a hero.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a real dismal failure in terms of A, trying to keep him out, and B, trying to stop him having any undue influence as an undesirable. He probably, you wonder if they had just let him in and ignored him, he probably wouldn't have generated that much interest at all. But the perverse outcome was he was given a huge profile.
It shows the danger to a government, any government, in prolonged litigation in an issue where public opinion can be assembled or can change, and particularly if the government loses in the litigation. So this thing dragged on for about 6 months, and as you say, it became a farce. We'll come to it, but fast forward to see how speedily the whole Djokovic thing was dealt with in the courts. At least Australian courts, unlike American and other courts, will deal with these things on the spot.
Yes.
Pretty quickly. But in Kisch's case, he was granted bail, and the government failed in one case, had to start another. So the end result was he had 5 months, rounding up a lot of support. There were hundreds of thousands of people went to his rallies.
Yeah. As I said, a pretty perverse outcome from the government's point of view. He must have had an amazing legal team surrounding him, and obviously his supporters helped him with the significant cost in assembling that team, because they really were not giving up at every stumbling block, at every time they lost the case, they doubled down and tried again and tried a different tact, as did the government. But it was in the end for Menzies and the Lyons government, death by 1,000 cuts, and they just said, "Go away, we're sick of you."
Well, he did have Alfred Piddington, who had been appointed to the High Court a decade or so earlier, but had not sat. He did have a judge, in this case Evatt, who was very acute. He was at the height of his powers, and who, let's face it, had sympathies for freedom of speech. When Menzies took up the cause in Parliament, he was attacked in Parliament for saying, look, you've been a great supporter of free speech. How can you justify taking this position? But every Attorney-General has to do his brief for the government he's in, and so it was no criticism intended. But it was deeply ironical that Menzies would be caught up in this deeply losing brief.
Tell me a bit more about Piddington and Evatt. There was an interesting scene in the court, wasn't there, in the High Court, where Evatt suggests to Piddington's junior to change tact in terms of his legal argument, and there's a question over whether Evatt was perhaps acting appropriately there, and or perhaps engaging in a little bit of judicial activism in on behalf of Egon Kisch. How do you read that situation?
Well, I don't agree with the label judicial activism. It's become a nasty word for a legal ruling that you happen not to like. If it's one that you like, it's okay, but if it's one you don't like and it involves some development of the earlier law, judicial activism. But whatever did here was sort of something different. Almost any judge will have had the experience of hearing a case where there's a litigant in person or a barrister who is making a meal of it. And you can see a whole lot of stupid points being taken, but you might see a grain of a good one. It's generally okay in the course of the argument, in the presence of everybody else, to say something like, have you thought about... is this what you're trying to say? Or, look, there's a recent case that you might like to go away and have a look at, or that sort of thing. Now, some people, obviously there are limits to this, but if the judge has to decide the case according to the law, then he or she is entitled to draw aspects of the law to attention. But what Evatt did here was, as I understand it, he contacted the junior counsel out of court and privately and said, look, the argument that you're mainly running, which is that the law is unconstitutional, is probably not going to run because the High Court has already decided that point. Why don't you I don't know the exact words he used, but as reported in the history books, he said, look, you might be better off approaching the matter on the basis that the minister has recited that the British government told him this and that and this and that, but there is no evidence of it. And so next day, that was the point that was taken, and Evatt said, yes, I uphold that point. I mean, after having given the government an opportunity, he said, look, if you want an adjournment to come up with this evidence, please do. And at one stage in the litigation, Menzies swore an affidavit. I think it was Menzies or the minister, can't remember which. And the opposition said, we want to cross-examine the minister on this. And the government lawyer, under instructions, said, no, the minister doesn't want to be cross-examined. The affidavit was withdrawn, so there was no evidence
I see.
to go on.
I see.
Yes.
Yeah. So in the end, quite a simple point, really.
Yes, everybody would disapprove, a secret communication by a judge to one party about litigation. But it has happened.
So the issue was calling the junior counsel into his office privately, away from scrutiny of the public in the court hearing, and having that conversation offline, as they say these days.
Yes. Yeah.
So Keith, I just wanted to probe you a bit more about this dictation test. So you have the high farce of the Egon Kisch case, and Scottish Gaelic, and was it a European language or not? And he obviously didn't pass the Scottish Gaelic test, nor did the police officer who was trying to give it to him. But after all this, the dictation test wasn't repealed until 1958. So despite the fact there was all this high farce around this, it was maintained as a part of Australian government immigration policy in order to keep Australian migrants European. But was there less and less respect after this for the dictation test? Did it fall out of favour, or it was just accepted as a useful tool?
Oh, no, there was less and less respect. Of course, there was also some swing in the pendulum about the White Australia policy behind, which was all, designed to serve. It was a fig leaf, but a less embarrassing fig leaf than to try and prove that this particular person is Asiatic or didn't have a right to be in the country. But yes, it continued to be used, very rarely on anyone but a Chinese or Indian or Fijian, would-be immigrant. But it was abolished in 1958, as you said, and my understanding, the White Australia policy was abolished in 1973.
Once and for all.
So I'm not quite clear in my recollection as to what they did in the dying days of the White Australian policy to give effect to it. It probably wasn't as efficiently run as it was in the days of the dictation test.
Indeed. I wanted to ask you for your reflections then on Menzies during this period of the Egon Kisch case. I mean, you said before he'd been a proponent of free speech prior to his appointment as Attorney General, Federal Attorney General. So it was a little bit curious that he was now a staunch advocate for stamping down on this gentleman from Czechoslovakia coming and wanting to talk about anti-fascism. But he was doing his job as a Attorney General in the Lyons Government. It was obviously the Lyons Government's strong wish that Egon Kisch not be in the country. Did it reflect badly on Menzies? Was it a major blow to him? It was obviously a great win for Evatt we've had on this podcast before, Gideon Haigh, who's written a biography of Evatt, talking about the Evatt v Menzies sort of nemesis relationship, which is an extraordinary one over many decades. Yeah. And there are so many parallels. They were so alike in so many ways in their upbringing, their education, their interests, and there's a counterfactual that possibly Evatt could have been a member of Menzies' Liberal Party if life had turned out a bit differently, but anyway, he wasn't. But yeah, how does Menzies come out of this saga? Well, bad, okay.
Oh well, look. If you look at it just in isolation, not his finest hour, but it would have been. At the time, it would have been seen as just one of a huge number of other issues in which he was engaged. There was the Depression, the Lang. I think the fight over the Lang government was continuing, or maybe it was a little bit earlier. The lead up to the war, Menzies certainly tried to distance himself a bit from it. In one of his memoirs, he sort of said, well, I inherited the problem and it was the previous Minister for Immigration who had set the wheels in motion. Look, I don't think the establishment, including Menzies, sort of perceived this as big a slap in the face as it was all happening. It happened over a period of months, and in retrospect, it looks like a big disaster. I don't think we know enough about what Menzies did or didn't do or could have done. What is clear that Evatt, entirely properly, except for the one example we spoke about, applied rules of strict legal interpretation in favour of freedom and developed administrative law in ways that would take many decades later before any other judge applied administrative law with the sort of vigour that Evatt did. It's interesting that nobody thought to run the point that the dictation test was really intended for non-Europeans. That would have been an interesting point. Anyway, your question is about Menzies. Yes, it was not his finest hour. He had a lot worse things happen to him later in his political career, and of course many greater successes. Yes. Several of them at Evatt's expense.
Indeed.
I think it shows Menzies as the pragmatist that he was. I think the fact that he drew stumps on the issue shows a bit of judgment. I think sometimes governments do have to pull their horns in, but he would have been very distant from the litigation. We can unpick the litigation in detail now because we have all the transcripts. But Menzies would have been sitting in Melbourne dealing with a whole lot of other issues, and people would just be putting papers under him to sign and do this.
And of course, what we'll never know is what the British government had on Kisch. I guess that was that the British Secret Service had decided not to share with the Australian people, and the fact that the Australian government withdrew their affidavit saying they had evidence from the British government and refused, and of course the minister refused to be questioned on that issue, or cross-examined on that issue. So we will never know. It doesn't look like too much bad came from the Egon Kisch visit anyway. So whatever their concerns were probably unfounded. If it hasn't come to light in 2022, I'd say it's not coming to light.
Kisch was pretty coy in his various affidavits about his involvement with communism. It came out frankly later in it, but he didn't, at a time when just to admit you're a communist was as good as a passport to trouble, he telling the whole truth.
Right.
But whether the British government really had the goods on him, or whether the British government, like the Lyons government, just had the view, if you're a communist, we don't really want you agitating, particularly in a pacifist context, because these were the anti-war group rallies. That was the main ticket that they were running. It was a pacifism, and that probably wasn't British or Australian policy in the 30s.
And I think we've got to remember the context of the time, that interwar period. And, we were in the sort of 5 years before the start of the Second World War. The stakes were pretty high for governments, and there was a whole load of censorship and messaging that was very carefully controlled by governments because of security concerns and concerns about the public sentiment that we're just not used to in a peaceful time like we live in now, for despite all the sort of geopolitical tensions that surround us these days. But look, Australia has a track record of keeping out undesirable people for various reasons. We've kept out people who might want to come to Australia and spout hate speech about various races or religions. But our latest high-profile immigration case didn't involve someone who particularly hated anyone, but he was considered pretty undesirable by the federal government, and it looks like the state government as well. And that was a tennis player by the name of Novak Djokovic. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that case, which as we know, came before the full court of the federal court, didn't it? Yes.
Well, of course, I see it just through the prism of what was decided there, and my particular interest is the similarities and comparisons between the Kisch situation and the present situation. In both eras, it was ultimately a ministerial declaration that would be the passport out of the country. It would be the minister declared that he or she was satisfied that you were a threat. That was the box that, if it was properly ticked, all that had to happen. By the present time with Djokovic, that law has been much refined and changed in response to years of litigation over immigration detention in the federal court and the High Court. In Kisch's day, there wasn't anything like a visa that we have it. Kisch would have shown his passport to the British consul in Paris, and who'd have just checked, yes, it's a proper passport, and visa is based on I have seen. So it wasn't then seen as a piece of paper. It was an act. So it had been just checked, and yes, everything seems in order. And in his day, the decision would be made at the time of entry, or sometimes before entry, if the government could make the declaration, as they tried to do when Kisch's ship was steaming into Perth. Of course, in the present time, Mr. Djokovic, like anybody else, had to get a visa before he entered, and if that visa held up, it would be the passport through immigration when he arrived. And so we know when he was first confronted, there were proceedings, but they were based on the failure to give him a reasonable opportunity to meet whatever case was made. And so the immigration officials' decision to cancel his visa was itself set aside because of lack of procedural fairness. So Djokovic enters the country, and the question is to the government, if we want to get him out, how do we get him out? And I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in those 3 days it took.
Yes, it took a while, didn't it?
The affidavit. This is absolutely pure hypothesis, but what if Minister Hawke had said, well, the lawyer, why do you want him out of the country? Oh, well, the opinion polls, no, you can't rely on opinion polls. The Prime Minister rang me, no, you can't rely on
the access public health and good order, doesn't it?
No, we can't rely on that. So eventually, I won't say they came up with, but eventually they descended to a ground which was the ministerial statement that his presence was inimical to good order in Australia, and that it was in the public interest that he not remain, provided those two boxes were ticked to the satisfaction of the minister. Then it's very, very hard for a court to second guess that. It's not impossible, but that's a very high hurdle. So, unlike Kisch, there weren't a series of delayed hearings with, to use the comparison, Djokovic going off to play the Australian Open while the lawyers argued it out in court. Whereas Kisch was granted bail repeatedly. I don't know the details, but there wasn't an application, and for all I know, there wasn't a power to have let him out while the case was being... But anyway, it was resolved very, very quickly. Another interesting comparison is that in Kisch's case, it was what Kisch was going to be saying that clearly was upset the government, and that he would be a rallying point for views that the government didn't want to be given any more oxygen than possible. In Mr. Djokovic's case, and the federal court made much of this, that the piece of the legislation said that if the presence of the person would be inimical to good order in Australia, but the key word was the presence. So what he said was irrelevant. There still had to be some thought process that by being there, he was either attracting attention or conveying implicit messages that would allow the anti-vaxxers to spread their false message and would undermine the attempt to beat the pandemic, which the majority of Australians are 110% behind.
Of course. What I find curious, though, Keith, is getting vaccinated in Australia is not a legal requirement for everyone. There are certain professions whereby it's a condition of you working in that area that you must be vaccinated. So there's federal government which doesn't mandate vaccinations. I don't think it's all the state governments who are choosing what professions have a mandate for a vaccination. So the federal government is saying that we think this person who we believe is a sort of a clarion call for the anti-vax movement, we think the presence of this person in our country, even though we don't mandate everyone to get a vaccination, so you're actually free to not be vaccinated if you don't want to. Obviously, it's going to limit your ability to do various things these days. But we think that is not going to be good for the good order and public order of Australia, and therefore he should be booted out. He shouldn't be allowed in Australia. It's a very, very, very high bar, isn't it? So Djokovic hasn't done anything illegal in not being vaccinated in terms of, there are Australians who are not vaccinated because they just don't want to be. Yeah. And yet we're just saying, well, the government thinks it's a nice idea to be vaccinated and it would be good for everyone, and therefore someone who's not vaccinated in our society is going to set a bad example, and therefore, well, because he's not an Australian, he has to leave.
Well, the Parliament has chosen to arm the minister with this power to stipulate that this particular power isn't subject to natural justice.
No.
I'm not here to support or attack the policy behind that, but the decision was made, namely that we would rather the executive government call this shot. Obviously, they are responsible to Parliament and through Parliament to the people. In this case, of course, what Minister Hawke was doing clearly had, a lot of support from the Australian people.
Yes.
But we lawyers or civil libertarians may say, well, one argument I've heard is, well, if this applies to Djokovic, it could apply to Greta Thunberg, because you've got someone whose views are controversial. That's all you need to say. They might be good controversial, bad controversial. Yes, we've had far right Holocaust deniers, but I think all I can say is that's the call that Parliament has made in, and the word presence is, if their presence is there. Ironically, if Djokovic had been the other Czech, there was another tennis player, wasn't there?
Yes, a female
Czech. I don't know whether
was she Czech? What's wrong with these Czech?
So. I don't know whether she was. They're good tennis players. I don't know whether she was an anti-vaxxer, but let's assume that there was a low-profile anti-vaxxer who came in. It would be, assuming the minister wanted to use the same power, I think it'd be much harder to establish to anyone's satisfaction that it was a genuine use of that power. So it's this combination of Djokovic's profile and the extreme stringency of this law and the low bar of judicial review. Now one rather wicked thought I've been having, thinking about this, is whether in any way the use of this power in this context could be said to infringe the implied principle of freedom of speech that was established in the
Australian Capital Television case.
ACTV. Yes. Yeah. That is a constitutional implication which limits federal lawmaking power. And the question, the hypothetical question, the interesting question, the armchair jurisprudence question is, what if Djokovic had said, yes, I am going to speak my views and I am going to wear a T-shirt saying vaccination is bad and freedom is good and whatever.
Yeah.
So it would have brought into the open the issues that you were raising, namely, in reality, there are freedom of speech issues lying behind the thing. They are a bit more suppressed with Djokovic than they were with Kisch. Nobody argued the point, and as I say, because the trigger was that his presence alone was enough, but what was inimical about his presence? Was it the message he was conveying, or was it the message that people of undesirable views would attribute to him? So if you have a cause and you see, well, he's the lightning rod, I'm going to say yes, and it's not just Mr. So-and-so who has these views. There's even that nice bloke Novak Djokovic holds these views, and therefore, give greater credence to them. But anyway, I'm not saying there was no free speech issue intruded. There's a little bit of a hint in one passage in the federal court where they say, thank heavens we don't have to go there. And Yeah.
But as you say, the immigration minister's power to prevent someone entering is pretty broad, and there were very few grounds for Djokovic's lawyers to really appeal against the immigration minister's decision on the basis of Djokovic's presence in Australia being a threat to the public health and good order of Australia. So there were limitations, but it is very interesting that the freedom to express a view on vaccination hasn't, in the current climate, because I think people are so keen to get out of this pandemic, that concern around free speech has been really pushed to the side, as I think it would be in times of war too, where there are genuine security concerns in society. I mean, we've got a sort of a health security concern now. You see free speech really falling down the rung of priorities in people's lives. So the general public's view was not to be concerned about Djokovic's free speech or the free speech of people who might have supported him. No, look, just go away. We want to live our lives. Get over COVID, please. Just let's.
And let's face it, Djokovic's people. Djokovic did not run that argument.
He did not run that argument. No.
His argument was that I'm not here to speak.
No.
And I'm not diseased, and so why throw me out? I was talking to a Canadian friend this morning about apparently some injunction has been granted against all those truck convoys that are blocking the roads who are hooting their horns all the time. And so a judge has granted injunction against hooting the horn, and they have raised a free speach argument.
Is a horn speech? Is a horn speech though?
That was what the judge said. He said, I don't think tooting your horn is an exercise of free speech. But
doesn't come out of your voice box.
But we've all seen bumper stickers, if you're in favour of me, hoot your horn. So, but anyway, all of these things, in a sense, I think we should be grateful that our Australian system gives speedy justice. It meant that there was a decision, in this case an appellate decision, granted in a matter of days, and everybody knuckled down. I've been involved as a judge in Fiji where cases, the Constitution looks wonderful, but cases take years and years and years to get there. And my perception of the American situation is it's a little bit the same, whereas Australia has always been, if you say you have a right of liberty, we'll see you in court tomorrow. And that's what happened with Kisch and with Djokovic.
And that's a testament to the success of our legal system in Australia, that the cogs of justice do move very, very swiftly when it comes to people's personal liberty. So that's something to be extremely grateful for. Thank you so much, Keith, for talking to me on the Afternoon Light podcast about Egon Kisch and Menzies and Everett, and of course Novak Djokovic and free speech and the power of the immigration minister that continues to this very day. It's been fascinating, and I really appreciate the time you've taken to talk to us at the Robert Menzies Institute.
Thank you for having me.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.